Hey everyone. Today, we're diving into the story of King David, a figure who's just as legendary as he is complex. Now, if you haven't heard of David, he was the second king of ancient Israel, a guy who went from being a humble shepherd to one of the most iconic leaders in biblical history. And trust me, his journey is anything but ordinary. So, let's start with who David really was. Born around 1000 BCE, he was the youngest of 8 sons from a pretty regular family in the tribe of Judah. Imagine being the youngest kid with 7 older brothers. He was definitely not the first pick for future king material. But here's the twist, David wasn't just any shepherd. He had this deep passion for God, and he was also quite the musician and poet. Some of the Psalms in the Bible, those heartfelt songs and prayers, are actually attributed to him. David's life was full of highs and lows. He was known for his bravery in battle and his skills in warfare, but he also had his fair share of flaws, like his infamous affair with Bathsheba. Despite all this, he is remembered in both Judaism and Christianity as a king who, despite his flaws, had a heart that was deeply connected to God. Now, let's get into the traditional story of how David was chosen to be king. The prophet Samuel, who was basically God's messenger at the time, was sent to find a new king because the current one, Saul, was not doing a great job. Samuel ended up in Bethlehem, at the house of Jesse, David's father. Jesse showed off all his older sons, thinking one of them would be the next king, but none of them were chosen. Finally, they brought in David, the youngest one who was out in the fields tending sheep. And wouldn't you know it, this young shepherd boy was the one Samuel anointed as the future king. Even though David didn't look like a typical king, he was young, maybe even a bit scrawny. He had something special, a courageous spirit and an unwavering love for God. From that moment, things started to change for David. The Bible says that the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him, setting him apart for the incredible journey ahead. Meanwhile, things were not looking so great for King Saul. The Bible describes how an evil spirit began to torment Saul, causing him a lot of distress. One of Saul's servants remembered that David was a talented musician and suggested bringing him to play music to soothe the king, and it worked. Whenever David played his lyre, Saul felt relief, and the evil spirit would leave him. But David was much more than a musician. He was also a warrior. The famous story of David and Goliath shows just how brave he was. Picture this, the Israelites and the Philistines are on opposite sides of a valley, each army too scared to make the first move. The Philistines had a giant named Goliath, who was about 10 feet tall and intimidating as you can imagine. He challenged the Israelites, mocking them and their God. David, still a young shepherd boy, stepped up and volunteered to face Goliath. Even though King Saul and the rest of the army were doubtful, David's faith was unshakable. Armed with just a sling and a few stones, David went out to meet the giant. Goliath laughed, calling David a child and mocking him. But David, with incredible confidence, declared that he was fighting in the name of the Lord. And then it happened. With one shot from his sling, David hit Goliath right in the forehead, knocking him out cold. David then took Goliath's own sword and finished the job. This incredible victory sent the Philistine army into a panic, and they fled. King Saul was so impressed that he took David into his court and basically adopted him into the royal family. So, after David's incredible rise to fame and his many successes, things start to get a bit complicated. King Saul, who once admired David, began to feel threatened by his popularity. Think about it, David was out there winning battles and earning the love of the people, and then there's this song echoing through the streets. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. Now, imagine Saul hearing that. His ego took a massive hit. This praise for David only fed Saul's growing envy and paranoia. Saul's jealousy soon turned dangerous. He saw David not as a loyal servant or even a friend but as a rival to his throne. It got to the point where Saul's jealousy was so intense that he tried to kill David multiple times. And believe it or not, Saul's motives even corrupted something as sacred as marriage. When he offered his daughter Michal to David in marriage, it wasn't out of fatherly affection. No, Saul was hoping that this would be a trap, a way to ensnare David, possibly even get him killed. But David wasn't alone in this turmoil. He had a powerful ally, Saul's own son, Jonathan. Jonathan was not just a friend to David, he was like a brother. Jonathan tried to defend David to his father, but Saul's rage had reached a fever pitch. In a shocking outburst, Saul even insulted Jonathan, saying things like, "You son of a perverse and rebellious woman." He accused Jonathan of betraying his own family for David, whom he now saw as a sworn enemy. It was in that heated moment that Jonathan realized just how deep his father's hatred for David ran. Saul's obsession with killing David had blinded him to everything else, even his love for his own son. Despite this, Jonathan remained loyal to David. He made a solemn promise to protect him, knowing that David was innocent and undeserving of Saul's wrath. The two friends made a covenant, vowing to always look out for each other's families. From then on, it was a game of cat and mouse. Saul was constantly hunting David, driven by his jealousy and fear. But David, showing his true character, refused to harm Saul, even when he had the chance. David's men often urged him to strike back, but he wouldn't do it. He saw Saul as God's anointed and believed it wasn't his place to harm the king. This shows us just how noble David was, choosing to repay Saul's evil intentions with mercy. There was a famous moment when David and his men were hiding in a cave, and Saul unknowingly entered to rest. David had the perfect opportunity to kill Saul, but instead, he only cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Once Saul left the cave, David called out to him, showing the piece of fabric. He was basically saying, "Look, I could have taken your life, but I didn't. I'm not your enemy, even if you think I am." Saul, realizing how close he came to death, broke down in tears. He finally saw the truth. David wasn't trying to steal his throne or harm him. Instead, David had shown mercy, something Saul hadn't done. Saul even asked David to promise that when he became king, he wouldn't kill all Saul's descendants. David, of course, agreed. It was a tense, emotional moment, but Saul's jealousy was far from over. Despite these moments of clarity, Saul's hatred for David only grew. His actions became more desperate, leading him down darker paths. He even resorted to killing innocent priests who helped David, showing just how lost he was. It was as if Saul's fear and jealousy had consumed him, turning him into a shadow of the man he once was. One of the most striking scenes was when Saul, completely desperate, visited a witch to summon the spirit of the prophet Samuel. This was totally against God's laws, but Saul was so desperate for guidance. The spirit of Samuel basically told him, "Why are you asking me for help now that God has turned against you?" It was a chilling reminder of how far Saul had fallen. As Saul's reign spiraled downward, David's continued to rise. But David's journey wasn't without its own mistakes, like his infamous affair with Bathsheba. And so, after the tragic death of his son with Bathsheba, David's troubles didn't end. Remember, Nathan the prophet had warned him about the consequences of his actions, and those prophecies were still unfolding. David's family seemed to unravel before his eyes, starting with a heinous act committed by his eldest son, Amnon, against his half-sister Tamar. Imagine Tamar, filled with kindness, going to care for her supposedly ill brother Amnon, only to be deceived and assaulted by him. Unlike Shechem, from the story of Dinah, who sought to make amends after his terrible act, Amnon's disdain for Tamar only grew. He didn't just violate her body, he shattered her spirit. Tamar was left devastated, and her brother Absalom, instead of seeking immediate justice, told her to remain silent. But silence didn't mean acceptance. 2 years passed, and Absalom's rage festered. He plotted and eventually lured Amnon into a trap, killing him to avenge his sister's honor. After the murder, Absalom fled to his grandfather's house in Geshur and remained there for 3 years, harboring thoughts of power and revenge. When he finally returned, he began to scheme against his own father. With charm and deceit, he won the hearts of the Israelites, preparing to steal David's throne. David, now older and perhaps wearier, didn't want to face his son in battle. Instead, he fled Jerusalem to avoid bloodshed, but the conflict was inevitable. In a dramatic twist, Absalom, riding his mule through the thick forest, got his hair caught in a tree. Dangling helplessly, he was an easy target. Joab, David's general, saw his opportunity and killed Absalom, despite David's orders to deal gently with him. When David heard of his son's death, his grief was immense. He cried out, "Oh, my son Absalom! My son Absalom! If only I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." This was the cry of a father, mourning not just the loss of his child but perhaps also the loss of innocence, peace, and control over his own household. His sorrow was so deep that Joab had to confront him, reminding him of the loyalty of his men and the need to lead as a king, not just as a grieving father. Despite the turmoil and betrayal, David's life wasn't only about conflict and suffering. He was also a poet and a musician, known for his psalms and his deep relationship with God. Even as he faced the turmoil in his family and kingdom, he never abandoned his faith. His life ended in a mixture of accomplishments and regrets. God had promised that David's line would endure, but it wouldn't be him who would build the temple. His son Solomon would take on that sacred task. As David lay on his deathbed, he knew his time was coming to an end. He gave his final instruction to Solomon, advising him to follow God's commandments and to walk in his ways, emphasizing the importance of wisdom and integrity. It was his last attempt to guide his son and ensure a better future for the kingdom he had fought so hard to establish. David passed away around 970 BCE, leaving behind a complex legacy. His reign had expanded Israel's borders and established Jerusalem as its capital. Yet, the personal failings and familial conflicts painted a more nuanced picture of a man who was both deeply flawed and remarkably chosen by God. As for evidence of David's historical existence, it's a fascinating mix of ancient inscriptions and archaeological finds that keep historians and archaeologists intrigued. The Tel Dan inscription, discovered in 1993, and the Mesha stele, unearthed in the 19th century, both make mention of the House of David. These inscriptions suggest that there indeed was a real Davidic dynasty, even if the exact details of his life and reign remain a blend of history and scripture. Additionally, archaeological digs have revealed potential ties to David's era, such as inscriptions bearing the name of one of David's rivals, Eshbaal, and evidence of a population boom in Judea during the 11th century BCE. These pieces come together to suggest that the stories of David and his kingdom, while interwoven with religious narrative, are grounded in a historical reality that shaped the future of the Israelite people. David's story is a reminder that even the mightiest kings are human, subject to failings and passions. Yet, despite his many flaws, he is remembered for his heartfelt psalms, his deep connection with God, and his role in shaping a nation. David's life wasn't just a series of battles and betrayals, it was a testament to the complexities of leadership, faith, and humanity. And with that, we close the chapter on one of history's most enigmatic and compelling figures, King David, whose legacy still resonates thousands of years later.